And we're back again, and this is Patrick, the Backwoods Tech, and you're listening to Dr. Rob's Spirits and the Supernatural. And we're getting ready to have our celebrity questions this week. We're having Richard Pryor on. And Dr. Rob, is Richard Pryor with us now?
Yes, Patrick, he is actually. We were actually speaking about him a couple of days ago and wondering what the connection was, why he was coming through to us. And so I'm anxious to give a message from him today. And so it's always a pleasure to speak to those who've crossed over, and especially when it comes to some of my favorite comedians and actors. And he definitely falls in that category. Been very much a part of his career since the 70s, and seen a lot of his films and a lot of his work, and he's really ahead of his time for sure.
Well, and a lot of the comedians we're familiar with today got their inspiration and influence from Richard Pryor. I mean, I know Eddie Murphy and several other ones. He was kind of the one that inspired them to get into comedy and show business. So this should be very interesting. And actually, my first question is, for Richard, if he had been wanting to try and come through, because you know how a lot of times I'll keep telling you when it seems like you keep having somebody pop up. No matter what I'm doing, I'll find links on the web, this and that. And what was interesting about, in this case, remember we were talking to Jerry Orbach, and he had made that remark about, I forget how we got on the subject, but about me having Netflix and everything. And I just happened to go look up under Jerry Orbach under Netflix to maybe look up, some of his other stuff, because I mainly knew him from Law and Order, and then I saw him in Dirty Dancing, which was ironic because we just had Patrick Swayze on there when Jerry Orbach was coming through. And ironically, the first thing when I type in under Jerry Orbach on Netflix, Richard Pryor pops up because they were in Brewster's Millions together along with John Candy. So that's why I was curious if he had really been trying to come through to us, because I've just been seeing too many coincidences involving Richard.
And, I as I've told you, there's no coincidences, and with all of these stars that have been coming through, it just seems like we pick them at random, and just, whoever we might be interested in, whoever we think the audience might be interested in, we just keep seeing these connections come back over and over and over again. I mean, granted, in Hollywood, there's only so many stars out there that are popular, and, a lot of them have been in other movies. And I remember back in the 80s and 90s, we said, the 7 degrees of separation between Kevin Bacon and the rest of the world. Well, really, all these stars that we've been interviewing, pretty much with the exception of a couple, have all had connections together. So Richard says that he's just laughing at us now. He's got that really cool laugh, and he's just kind of like shaking his head, just kind of just sitting there going
Incidentally, where is Richard sitting at, Dr. Rob? Is he in our spare guest chair here, or where's he at?
Actually, he's kind of just pacing right here in front of us, and he's never one to sit down. He said when he was alive, he was always full of energy, and sitting was not something he was used to. And even during the interviews, he said in some of the shows he did, it would drive him crazy. He would get up and walk and pace during the breaks, and so for him, movement is definitely on the other side. It's still part of his personality. He's kind of talking to me in that funny drawl of his. It was an act, he said, but for me, it's kind of how I remember him. So it's kind of funny to hear him try to describe things to me, and I'm just like, oh, okay, all right, now I'm back in the 70s.
Yeah, he was quite a character. I know he did a lot of movies with Gene Wilder also. I'm assuming he probably keeps tabs or probably still visits Gene, because we don't really hear much about Gene Wilder anymore.
They had a close connection when he was alive, obviously, and really, that's something that when we have close friends like that, we don't really lose track of them. And with a lot of the stars from that time, especially with Jerry Orbach, even though they were not in the same category of stardom, he said they were pretty good buddies. And John Candy especially, he really was fond of him, and they get together quite often and kind of talk about old times and kind of deal with that. He said Jerry's pretty private and really doesn't have much to do with anyone or anything. So he's, when he sees him, it's kind of like, hey, Jerry, it's that kind of attitude. And he has still has the same sense of humor. Let's just put it that way. He's kind of making faces at me now, and I'm just kind of laughing at him. I'm just like, come on, let's be serious. And he said there's never a serious interview with him. I'm surprised that I haven't heard the F word a few times, just out of remembrance for what he was good at, for sure.
I'll give him time. I'm sure he'll slide it in there somewhere. Yeah, so it sounds like, actually, I guess, is he kind of adjusted now? But 2005 is when he died. So he's had a few years, and actually it was December 10th. So yeah, he's had almost close to 6 years now since his passing. So would he say he's at peace now?
He says finally at peace. He said his life was always hard for him from the very beginning, and he said, even from his childhood, a lot of abuse, a lot of drug abuse as well. And that's one of the things that he was talking to me prior to the show about, letting people know that it's not good to do drugs, it's not good to be out there, in that way. And so for him personally, this is his way of touching in with us for sure.
Yeah, I know that was kind of almost like battling a chronic disease throughout his life, because he really had to wrestle with that a lot with his addictions, and we'll be getting into some of that coming up. What was his actual final cause of death?
He says his heart just stopped. He had a lot of other problems, but that really was his cause of his passing. He said he went peacefully, suddenly. He wasn't really, I was expecting it, of course, due to illness, but he was kind of just taken from us in a very peaceful manner. He said that, for him, it was kind of a flash in his head, and that was it, and that's one of the things he was grateful for. He said he spent a lot of years, trying to deaden the pain, and for him, at the end of his life, it was hard for him to, see where his career could have gone compared to where it went. He said, a lot of studios wouldn't take a chance with him because of all the rumors of drugs and the actual drugs themselves. He said he was suffering from mental illness, and he was using the drugs to kind of counteract that, and that was one of the things that people don't understand about him, for sure.
Yeah, it seems pretty common that, so I guess he was basically self-medicating then, wasn't he?
He said absolutely. He said there was a lot of treatments out there, and he was always going through treatment program after treatment program after treatment program. But he said he never could really get clean. He would go for a year or 2 years and not do drugs, and then all of a sudden, boom. He says that a lot of people remember him for the freebase accident that he had, several years back, several decades back. He said, and it kind of never left him. People were just looking at him as if he was, a drug addict, and he pretty much was. He said, and for him, now he's clean and sober, and he's enjoying life, and he's able to be himself. It's much more enjoyable. He said he was really suffering from major paranoia at the end of his life, and he thought really everybody was out to get him, the government was out to get him, everybody's out to get him, and so for him personally, it was just a real peaceful experience to go ahead and make that crossing and kind of come back to himself. He said he just lost track of everything, and his money too. He said it was a lot of people took advantage of him. They would give him drugs just so they could take his money, and it was really hard for him sometimes to deal with people because he couldn't trust them, because he knew they were going to steal from him. They would steal stuff out of his house, and then they would tell him that he sold it, and things like that. And so he said it was just, one nonstop, screw me over, and he said the F word now, so I guess the F bomb is out there. But it just seems like, for him personally, that was one of the most frustrating parts is to be able to trust people. He said that's one of the reasons why he never had really good relationships, was because of that. He said, with all the women that he was involved with, they all seemed to take something from him every time, and it was, they married him for his name, not for love, and he said that's one of the things he's most disappointed in.
Well, I know, a lot of times throughout his career he was, wrestling with the drug addiction. I kind of heard that, I think Brewster's Millions, when he did that one, that was probably about the closest to sober he was throughout his whole career when he did that movie. Is that correct?
He said absolutely. He said they kept somebody on him 24/7 to make sure he didn't mess up, and he said it was like being in prison. He was pretty much in his trailer, and if he wasn't in his trailer, his bodyguard was around him, and he was trying to score even then. He said, and he just was something that they weren't going to allow to happen. They weren't going to allow his production to be screwed up, and he's really grateful. He said that there was a lot of friends out there who looked after him and really made sure that he made his money. He said he was pretty much broke when he made Brewster's Millions, and he said it was kind of funny that, the storyline was about giving away all the money so he could get money. And it's pretty much what he did his whole life. He said he pretty much did that maybe just to get some cash back into his pocket. He said about 6 months prior to that, he lost everything. He was almost at the point of bankruptcy. And if it hadn't been for that movie, he would have been bankrupt. He said it kind of bailed him out. He didn't really keep a lot of it after that because of the fact that he had to pay off a lot of debts. He said that when you live that kind of lifestyle, it's difficult sometimes to imagine not having money. But he said he was pretty much, rubbing nickels together is what he said.
And actually, though, I mean, that movie, I haven't watched it in a while, but that was one of my favorite ones of his movie. Actually went to try and watch that again the other night on Netflix, but I think you have to do it by a DVD. So I'll probably be watching it again. And, I had forgotten that John Candy was even in it, and I forget who Jerry Orbach played, but it is funny the connections you do have with some of these different stars or how they're all kind of intertwined.
Exactly. He said that, with, John Candy being his best friend in the movie, pretty much was his best friend outside of that as well. They always kept in contact. Even though John, kind of kept his distance, he didn't want to, get associated with the drugs. He said that, as long as he was sober, John would talk to him. But when he was back on the drugs, it was kind of hard to communicate with anybody. And, he kind of locked himself up as a recluse. He kind of describes himself like Howard Hughes. Is what he was feeling like, living in isolation. And people kept him isolated and, just so they could, continue to take advantage of his name.
Well, in a way, too, with the Brewster's Millions, I kind of, I would assume is the character he portrayed in that kind of really more like how he wanted to be, or that was just more of his true nature as kind of that type of person? Because, I mean, he played a pretty good character in there. It was pretty selfless, and you kind of almost pick up on it. Maybe that was more really how he could personally identify with that character himself.
He said that was more him. He said almost like an autobiography of his life. He came from nothing and he built himself up and, got a lucky break, in the early part of his career. And he said it just kind of carried him on. He said that he was always trying to be as outrageous as possible so that people would remember him and remember his name. And, Brewster's Millions was just one of his movies. He had several other movies as well. But, that was his kind of, who he was, always generous, always giving. He would buy people cars that needed it. He'd find out families didn't have food. He'd go and buy them a month's supply of food, and just always was, going above and beyond to the point of hurting himself sometimes because he just couldn't say no. And people knew that. That's why they showed up at his door. He said when he got famous, every relative, that was even fourth cousins, would show up and try to get something out of him. And he's always, willing to help family. He said family was very important to him. He was trying to make a family life for himself as an adult, but never was really able to settle down for the reasons he gave to us a little while ago.
Well, I know he was married 7 times. I think he had over 8 different children. Now, he was married twice to Jennifer Lee, and that was actually, they got back together, a few years before his death. So was she more of his soulmate, or what would he have to say about her, basically?
He would call her his addiction. He said that, out of all the women he was involved with, she kind of understood him the best, but she took advantage of him more than any of the others. And for him, she was an addiction. He kind of just felt connected to her, but he wouldn't say that she's his soulmate. He would say more of an addiction.
Okay, that's quite interesting. So, I mean, now he's told us some of the different people that he, is associated with, like John Candy and things like that, or who are some of the people he's regularly in contact with now?
He says that, he has a lot in common with Red Fox, who's one of his heroes. He said that, for him, that's a guy that they hang quite often. He said they're buddies, they have a lot in common, being, the forefront of a lot of comedy. A lot of comedians were following after them, and he said he kind of feels inspired to be a part of that gang. For him personally, that's really exciting. He says a lot of, what he's doing now is just inspiration, so like some of the other stars talk about. But for him personally, he's into nature. He's a nature guy, and he said that, he spends a lot of time in nature, just with the trees and just relaxing. He said he had a pretty rough life in this lifetime, and he does plan on coming back. He says that it's a definite go there. He said it won't be long. He said he's not gonna be specific with me, obviously, but he says within the next 25 years he'll be back with us. So we can definitely count on hearing from him again. He said this time he's going to come back as a white guy, though.
Well, actually, I guess Jerry Orbach and his wife were talking about coming back very shortly too. Which normally you'd always said that usually about 100-year waiting period is about how long they wait. So that's interesting that he's coming back too. So we're going to probably have a few potential stars popping up again in the near future. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, he said that, a lot of what he was about, in this life is going to be carried over. He said he's anxious to come back. He's anxious to get back into, society again. He said he's not one to sit on his hands. He's very proactive in the way he goes about things. He said next lifetime, though, he probably will not come back as a comedian. He said, that was kind of this lifetime. He's kind of making up for some of the other previous lifetimes. But he jokes with me about coming back as a white guy, not that he's, prejudiced or anything like that, he said. But he said it was a little bit easier. He thinks next life will be a little easier for him. So, he said he went through a lot of prejudices back in the 60s. He said that, people really don't realize how hard it was to be an actor. To be a comedian. And, the 60s, 70s for him were really about oppression. And really he felt very connected to the Civil War days. And he says that, for him personally as a slave, to society. But even back then he said he was a slave for many lifetimes. And so this was kind of his way of breaking free and getting even with the white man.
Well, that kind of does bring up another question I'd kind of wondered about, because, in the early 60s when he started his comedy, it was more of a clean, kind of wholesome family-type comedy, and then over that next 20 years, he kind of had that radical change in his format where it was more of a shock-type comedy, but he started winning some awards off that. But what really does he think influenced that, such a radical change in his style?
Drugs. That's what he says, drugs. Especially, he said that there's a lot of cocaine, heroin, cocaine. Those are the two favorite drugs combined even. And so for him, that was kind of just a change in his personality was due to the drug use. It was, and that he knew that he could make a name for himself if he was more outrageous than all of everybody else. Because he said there was a lot of comedians that were just, too goody-goody, and he kind of blended in with them, and he suddenly realized one day when he started throwing the F word out there, and, people started paying attention and were offended, and, it kind of gave him a boost to his ego, and then, of course, the drugs took into effect, and so it kind of just was what led him to where he was.
Yeah, it actually makes sense, because I think, at one point he was kind of, associated with Bill Cosby, and was more of a similar type of comedy with Bill Cosby until such a radical change.
Yeah, he said that Bill Cosby sold out. He said that Bill had a lot of comedic genius, he calls him, but he said he sold out a long time ago. He said that he never really respected Bill, from the very beginning. They had a falling out back in the 70s, and they kind of said F you to each other, and for him personally, it was just something that he just said, you can do what you want to do, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and you don't judge me. And he said that Bill was a very judgmental person. He still is. He said that he's very critical of others, and more critical of others than he is of himself. And he said that, for him personally, that was something that he never really forgave.
Well, that's too bad. Hopefully maybe they'll patch things up sooner or later, because actually you don't hear much about Bill Cosby anymore, too. He's probably getting up there in age also as well.
He said he's pretty much done. Everyone's heard everything he has to say. He's not very inventive. He's not really criticizing him necessarily, but he just says, it says to me that when connected to Bill, you've heard Bill in the 60s, you've heard him in the 70s, you heard him in the 80s, 90s, 2000, and he's still saying the same crap. We'll say the S word, but same crap. And for him personally, that was just like, well, you have so much talent. Why don't you come with something new? Why we keep rehashing things? And he said that Bill just became full of himself and just full of, the money. And that's why he said he sold himself out. He still has money, but he's not got anybody around him because he's pretty much isolated himself completely.
Well, it's a shame to hear, and it seemed like, I know with Bill, it was after his son was murdered that you really just didn't hear anymore, because he was in the middle of a sitcom which he was doing with Felicia Rashad, and that pretty much just ended. And I think that probably really had a lot to do with why you don't hear about Bill Cosby anymore.
No, he says that Bill was pretty much washed up at that point anyway, and he realized that his career was going to go down the tubes, and he wanted to stay as a legend. And he said that Bill pretty much just disappeared because he knew it was time. And he said, there's some new material coming out from him, but it's really just rehashed stuff. And, for him personally, on the other side, he's looking at it and just shaking his head. Told you so.
Part of it, we've discussed a lot of his drug use and things, but had he always wanted to be a star, or was there, what really influenced him to get into show business? Because, he really came from a rough childhood too, so the obstacles he was able to overcome over the years, in spite of things, was still pretty amazing.
He's quoting Jerry Maguire, "Show me the money." That was what it was all about, trying to get out of the hood, trying to get a better life. And when he realized that he could get paid for doing what he loved doing, it just just came about. He said that his discovery was something of a miracle on its own, and just doing a comedy routine pretty much gave him that break. And after that, he was addicted. Going up before the audience and performing and hearing the laughs and knowing that it was him that was producing those laughs was just addicting.
I'm sure now he can see how many people he did really make laugh over the years, because his material is going to be watched and viewed for years to come. I was even watching some of his just the other day, so he's basically still got his own immortality no matter what. Now, what did he like best about being a star, really, other than the drugs?
The women. He said between the drugs, the women, and the money, that was it. For him, he didn't really have much of a life outside of that. He said that was pretty much all what he was about. Just going, making the money so he could buy the drugs and have the women. And he kind of lost sight of who he was. He never really knew who he was, he said, until the very end. And he didn't really like what he saw at that point. So, for himself personally, that reflection kind of considered his life hell. Even though he did a lot of good, he still considered it, to be a hell for him on earth.
Well, that's quite interesting. Now, basically, who would he say he did enjoy working with the most?
He said Gene Wilder was a very good friend, very good at, being there for him personally. And so for him, that was kind of where he stood with things. It was an enjoyable life, and, his working with him was the best.
Yeah, they did do a lot of movies together, and they were a good comedic team. I know, especially, was it Hear No Evil, See No Evil? Some of those movies were just hilarious. They're just classics.
Absolutely. He said, that was some of the best writing of his life, and for himself personally.
Does anyone not get the concept of recording?
No, because it's not about him. So anyway, with those movies, he said that was just like comedic genius. The writing was the best possible. He said that with him personally, that was kind of, the best writing possible. And he said it just, was such a flow with Gene, and just a pleasure to work with him. And, Wilder is, still part of his daily routine. He said that, Wilder's wife was, really close to him as well. And Gilda, just has that special feel on the other side. He's definitely excited to be associated with her for sure.
Yeah, I was wondering, I was going to ask how she was doing, because I know, she lost her life to cancer years ago, and she had, Gilda Radner was a famous comedian that had been on Saturday Night Live, was married to Gene Wilder, so she has adjusted well then. I guess he's seen her and been in contact with her?
He said that, they see each other all the time. He said that's one of his best friends, and, they always had that close connection, and even back from even before Saturday Night Live, he said that he's known her for generation. He said, I don't know why you used that word, but it just seems like an appropriate word for him.
Okay. Now, he's also, now his daughter Rain's been pretty active, I think, in production and different things, too. And she's had to wrestle with some of her own addictions, but it sounds like I think she's on the right track now. So I'm sure he continues to try and guide and help her, I would assume.
He said that, Rain's a lot like him. She's suffering from mental illness as well. And so she's kind of gotten herself on the right regimen of medications. And he said that's kind of, where she stands with things, and she's in a good place.
Well, that's good. I mean, hopefully he was able to help her prevent making some of the same mistakes that he probably felt like he made. Now, you had mentioned some of his just different activities and getting back to nature. He was pretty big on animal rights activism, when he was alive. Is he still able to do any work with that at all?
He says that's part of the nature. Okay. He says for him that's part of the whole scheme of things. He said that, the animals are the basis of society, and, taking care of the animals means you're going to take care of the kids, which means you take care of the adults. And so he pretty much, stays involved as much as he can.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, it is interesting to hear just different activities that people do that, life continues on long after you're done living. So it's very fascinating to me. Is there anything he does miss about, living?
He says, no, not really. He paused, and I was like, okay, well, what's the pause for? And he thought about it for a second. He's like, not really, no.
Okay, so it does sound like he's definitely adjusted. Now, when he first crossed over, I mean, did he have a period that he really just was probably in a self-imposed hell or purgatory?
No, he said that for him, when he crossed over, it was instantaneous happiness. He felt that sense of relief and that sense of peace, and he said that was the first time he'd felt that in his whole life, and he kind of was relieved of all of his worries and his concerns, and for him personally, that was kind of just his adjustment period for sure.
Well, it's glad to hear he's adapted, because I know sometimes it takes people a little while, so probably, well, I mean, he battled health problems and everything, which also, he had multiple sclerosis for many years. Is there any advice you can give people that maybe have MS right now or battling it? I mean, what kind of worked for him, or what does he recommend not doing?
He says with MS, it's a lot about rest, and a lot about relaxation. And he said he had a hard time, even when he was trapped in his prison, he called it, at the end of his life. He said the MS was really caused by his, massive drug use. And, it was kind of a self-imposed prison for himself personally. That was one of the reasons why he felt relieved when he did pass, having that ability just to, get out of the body and, get out of that situation.
Well, he had, like I said, we've talked about before, he went through a lot of, personal obstacles throughout his life. Now, do you think any of that's residual from his rough childhood, or does he think that, there's a connection between them?
Not only the childhood, but, as he's been stating, mental illness is really the excuse, not really excuse, he says, but really the reason. And he said that, major mental illness doesn't really, with drug use, doesn't do well. You'd have hallucinations and think things were there that weren't there, and, just had a lot of problems with that, for sure. He said he would see people. He would be in a room and he would think that he was surrounded by people, and he realizes that it wasn't really a hallucination, it was more of a spiritual experience. And so for himself personally, now that he's crossed over, he sees all the spirits that are around us, and he kind of understands better, but he always felt like he was going crazy because he would have these guys in white coats around him, and he said that was kind of a bizarre experience for sure.
Wow. So that was the first thing I was going to guess too, is maybe he was, seeing more on the other side before his time. Now, does he harbor any resentments toward his parents, or how's the status with them now? Because I know they both died when he was younger, or he was probably like about 29 or 30. Does he see them now, or get along with them?
He says he pretty much, has forgiven them. Obviously, there's no resentment there, but he really doesn't have much to do with them. They're on another plane as far as he's concerned. And, they see each other from time to time, but it's not like they have a close relationship.
Well, was there any point that he would say that, he had a period of life that he was happy or was the happiest?
He said not really. No, he can't pick up any one particular period. He said that pretty much everything was crap, and of course he used the S word. And for him personally, this is kind of the best time. Now that he's on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, and he had a very, very, varied career as far as a lot of stand-up and movies. Did he enjoy the movies more than the stand-up, or what was his really favorite part about his career?
He said it was definitely the stand-up, dealing with the people and the public. He said he enjoyed that the most. He said, getting that live reaction he said he would sometimes sneak in the movie theaters and listen to people, and he would wear dark sunglasses so people wouldn't recognize him, and, just going on incognito, he said, kind of like a spy. He said he was always enjoying that, to see people's reactions to his films, and he never really enjoyed himself, watching himself, but he always enjoyed the public's reaction, kind of gave him inspiration.
Well, like I said, I mean, he did definitely give us a lot to remember him by, and it's been great having him here. Now, he's probably looking back, he probably sees maybe some answers or clues to how, he could have maybe handled his addiction problems. What advice would he have for people that are wrestling with these addictions still currently?
Admit you have a problem. And that's the one thing he said had a lot of pride, and he never wanted to admit he had a problem. Even though knew he was sick, he still wouldn't deal with it, and he said that's the first step is to deal with your problems, and he said face them. He said he was always running away from life and everything and everyone who cared about him. He'd always push everybody away, and except for the people that were bad for him. He said because he just didn't want to hear it. He didn't want anybody to argue with him. He felt like he knew everything, and that was where it was at.
Yeah, I mean it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So anyone is wrestling with these things, that is, if you don't realize there's a problem, you can't really, I guess, acknowledge it or deal with it. So it makes perfect sense. And throughout his career, I know at one part he did have the accident where he had set himself on fire. And at first, I think the press released it was like an accident. He was freebasing cocaine and caught himself on fire. And then later he did say that he tried to commit suicide. Had he really tried to do that, or?
It was kind of a combination of both. He knew the drugs were going to kill him, and he was just, at that moment, just really in a state of euphoria and didn't really realize what he was doing. But it wasn't really necessarily an intentional suicide. It was kind of accidental suicide.
Yeah, because I mean, and it really, you heard he did, some other, bits in movies, but I mean, it was kind of getting toward the end of his career because you really just didn't hear much from Richard for many years after that.
No one's really to take a chance with him. He said that a lot of it had to do with prejudices, but also the fact that nobody wanted to insure him. He said it was the most important part of doing movies was being insured, and people just didn't want to take the risk. And they were like, "Well, what happens if he goes off on the drugs again, and he disappears? And what are we going to do?" And he said that's a problem with a lot of the comedians of his era with the drugs of the '60s and '70s. He said that they didn't want to take a chance, which is understandable. He says.
I guess you wouldn't think about it, but I guess they would have to have like a high-risk studio insurance for Richard, or how does that work?
He says that, he's insuring him for millions of dollars, not only for his paycheck, but for the movie itself. He said that, people don't understand that about the film industry, is that all the actors are insured. If something happens, they're going to get the studio's going to get their money back. They've invested and then some. And he said that, he was uninsurable. Nobody wanted to take a risk.
Wow. Now, there was other periods. Now, it wasn't a real popular movie, but I kind of liked it when he was in Superman 3. I was curious if he had any connection or seen how Christopher Reeves and his wife are doing, or...
With Chris, he says that, he's aware of his presence, but not really, somebody he hangs out with. He said even in the movie, Chris kind of just kept to himself. He says that, it wasn't really like they were good friends or anything. They just kind of, showed up on set, and that was it. So, with their relationship, it's not really somebody, he says that he, would normally hang out with on the outside, let alone the inside. So it's kind of like a prison reference there, and so for him, they're aware of each other. They're not really, hanging out, but they, they respect each other, obviously.
That's good to hear, because I know he went through a lot too toward the end of his career, and we'll probably have him on at a later date when he starts coming through. I haven't been seeing him pop through on anything yet, so we'll leave that one for a later date. But it has been great having Richard on here. And is there anything else he would just like to speak his mind on? Because I think he was coming through pretty hard, or at least I got the impression that he was.
He says it's pretty much, with life and everything in general, don't worry. Don't worry. That's the big thing he says. He said he always worried about everything and everyone to the worst extremes, and he says, don't worry. And so I find that kind of interesting. I just want to thank you for connecting the interview and Richard for coming on. And when we come back from our break, we'll have our Star Corner.